Welcome back to my channel English Made Easy. In today's session, we shall discuss about relative clause and different types of relative clauses. Are you all ready? Hello. In this session, we shall discuss about relative clause, a very important topic for the 10th going children. Okay, let's see what a relative clause is. A relative clause is a clause used to describe a noun in a sentence. A clause which describes a noun, we know what a noun is, in a sentence is called a relative clause. It is also called as adjective clause. Why is it called an adjective clause? Because a word which describes a noun is called an adjective. So here relative clause describes a noun. So this relative clause is also called as an adjective clause. It starts with a relative pronoun which substitutes for a noun, noun phrase or pronoun. So a relative clause always starts with a relative pronoun. Okay, it has subject and verb but cannot stand alone as a sentence. So a relative clause is a dependent clause. It does not form a complete sentence. It forms only a part of a sentence. It should come immediately after a noun or a subject. So a relative clause immediately follows a noun and it should start with a relative pronoun. We use a relative clause to make sure which person or thing we are talking about. So we talk about a person and this relative clause describes about the person or the subject we are talking about. Okay, let's see some examples here. I bought a new car. It is very fast. See, the subject here is car and it is used to replace to talk about the car. Now instead of this it, we are going to replace it with a relative pronoun. Just see, I bought a new car which is very fast. So which is very fast forms the relative clause. The car is the noun here. Okay, so which is very fast is the relative clause and which is a relative pronoun. The subject is car. So this sentence has all completely satisfied all the rules of a relative clause. Okay, this is about the relative clause. We have two different types of relative clauses. Let's see what they are. Now before going into knowing what is the different types of relative clauses, we shall see what are relative pronouns. It's a new word which we have learnt right now. Let's see what is relative pronoun is and what type of relative pronouns we have and which pronoun is used at what point of time. What are relative pronouns and which pronoun should be used in which place? Okay, yes, we have different relative pronouns. Yes, and which pronoun should be used in which place you should know it very properly. A relative pronoun is a word which introduces a dependent clause and connects it to an independent clause. They are words that join clauses. So a relative pronoun is a word. You know different types of clauses. We have two types of clauses, independent clause and dependent clause. So a dependent clause cannot stand by itself like the relative clause. Okay, this relative pronoun which we use in a sentence joins a dependent clause to an independent clause and forms a complete sentence. It can be a complex sentence or a compound sentence. Okay, that we will see later on. Different types of sentences. We have 3 different types of sentences, but as of now here we will learn that a relative pronoun connects a dependent clause and an independent clause. So they are words that join the clauses. Examples of relative pronouns: who refers to people. When we talk about the subject, then we use relative pronoun who. Which refers to animals and objects. Whose refers to possession of things. Where refers to place, and whom refers to people. So there who refers to people also, but it's the subject, and whom here refers to the object of the verb. Okay, these are the relative pronouns which should be used compulsorily when we use a relative pronoun, relative clause. They start with a relative pronoun. So these relative pronouns should be compulsorily started with before a relative clause, and they immediately come after a subject or the noun. Okay, Now we have two types of relative clauses. Depending on the type of relative clause, they are classified into two types: defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. We should know the difference very properly so that we can use in the sentences properly. Defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Let's see the difference now. The difference between defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause is important to understand if you want to use relative clauses correctly. If you don't know the difference between these two clauses, you can't use the clauses itself properly. Because relative clause is very important in a sentence because it describes a noun. Because noun is the subject of the sentence. Without the subject, the sentence won't be complete. So since this clause describes the subject, this clause is very important, and we should know the two types of relative clauses also. A definite relative clause gives us essential information about who or what we are talking about and cannot be omitted from the sentence. It is a subordinate clause. So a definite relative clause gives the important information about the noun, without which the sentence will be incomplete. So a defining relative clause is very important in a sentence, and it cannot be omitted from a sentence. It is a subordinate clause. Let's see some examples here, you will understand better. This is the woman who stole my bag. So who stole my bag is the defining relative clause. So just remove that this part which is in red color, that is a defining relative clause. This is the woman. Is it making sense? It is not making sense. So this defining relative clause is a very important in a sentence, without which the sentence becomes incomplete. So this is the woman who stole my bag is a complete sentence. Okay, this who stole my bag is a defining relative clause, and this is the woman is another part of that is the independent clause. So we join these two to form a complete sentence. This is the book that I read. So again here, that I read is a defining relative clause. That is also a relative pronoun. Okay, next one. The car that I drive is a red Mercedes. So the car is a red Mercedes. Does not make sense. So the car that I drive is a red Mercedes. So in these three cases, if you remove the defining relative clause, will it make sense? It does not make sense. So a defining relative clause is very important to a sentence because it gives the essential information. What do you mean by essential? Important information which is very useful, without which the sentence becomes incomplete. So this is about the defining relative clause. Next one, non-defining relative clause. Non-defining relative clause gives additional information about the subject which may or may not be included in a sentence. So non-defining relative clause gives extra information which may or may, without which also the sentence will be complete, but here it gives extra information, additional information which may or may not be used. It's up to us. It is not, however, essential. It's not as essential as the previous one. If the clause is removed, the sentence still makes sense and has the same meaning. So if you remove the non-defining relative clause from the sentence also, the sentence meaning will not change and it makes complete sense, unlike the defining relative clause. Now let's see some examples here. My grandmother, who is 86 years old, is coming on holiday with us this year. So let's see here, who is 86 years old is the non-defining relative clause. Now let's remove this part and see the example. My grandmother is coming on holiday with us this year. Does it make complete sense? Of course it makes. Without this clause also, the sentence makes complete sense. So that's why a non-defined relative clause only gives extra information, without which the sentence may be complete. Next example. My car, which is Mercedes, can reach speeds of 140 km per hour. Now what is this part here? which is Mercedes is the non-defining relative clause. Let's see. My car, let's remove this and see. My car can reach speeds of 140 km per hour. Of course, if you remove this, it makes sense. So, this is another example. Next one. Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, is located at the northern end of Australian territory. So, this is this part. What is the clause here? Which is capital of Australia is the non-defined relative clause. So, if you remove this and see, Canberra is located at the northern end of Australian territory. So, this is the basic difference between defining relative clause and the non-defining relative clause. Okay, the basic things we have understood. Let's see some more examples. Let's see the examples. What major differences they are. Difference between defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Defining relative clause, no commas. So, there won't be any comma here. And non-defining relative clause between commas. So, this clause, before the start of the clause we have a comma, and at the end of this clause we have a comma. So, this is the basic difference between these two clauses. The first one has no commas, the second one has it is in between commas. Okay. Next one. Necessary information, essential to find out about which thing or person we are talking about. So, a defining relative clause gives the most important information, very essential information, without which the sentence will be incomplete. That is the second difference. This one, this non-defining clause, what do we have? Extra information. It gives additional information, not necessary to find out about which person or thing we are talking about. So, the sentence without this clause also makes sense and it is clear. That is the second difference. See some examples here. I call my brother who lives in Canada. So, I call my brother, does it make sense? If you remove this, it does not make sense. Then same type of example, let's see. My brother who lives in Canada is older. See, my brother is older. It makes sense, if you remove this clause also. So, that is the basic difference between these two clauses. Next one. We can use that instead of who and which for in a defining relative clause, but we cannot use that instead of who or which in non-defining relative clause because it gives only additional information. No, that's why we can't use a who and which. Next one. Relative pronouns can be omitted in some cases. So, in defining relative clauses, sometimes we can omit the relative pronouns. We can omit who, which, that when followed by subject plus verb. And second type of this clause, non-defining clause, relative pronouns cannot be omitted, cannot omit who or which. So, this is the basic difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Hope you have understood clearly. A simple basic difference is defining relative clause gives essential information about the subject in a sentence. It is a dependent clause. If it is omitted, the sentence won't make any sense. The non-defining relative clause, it gives additional information about the subject in the sentence and it can be omitted in a sentence. That is the basic difference. And it is between commas, it doesn't have commas. So, this is how we should understand these two type of clauses. The usage is very, very, very important when you write the sentences also. So, basically you should know the difference and know about these relative clauses. Hope you have understood the class very nicely. Hope you have reached all what I have explained to you. I hope this class will be very, very useful to you. Happy learning. Have a nice time.